Last week, something extraordinary happened. The sitting president of the United States personally called a Republican senator and exploded at her, using profanity and threats. Not a Democrat, not a reporter, someone from his own party. And the reason was simple. She voted to curb his authority. She wasn't the only one. Right now, in Washington, a situation is unfolding that we haven't seen in a very long time. Republicans, Trump's own Republicans, are quietly, carefully organizing against him, and they were doing it on the most dangerous ground imaginable. The president has power to take the country to war. This is not cable news spectacle. This is not another anonymous leak meant to dominate a news cycle. This is a group of lawmakers who have decided that loyalty has a breaking point, and that point has just been reached. What I'm about to explain isn't easy or straightforward. It involves emergency authorities, threats directed at allied nations, constitutional clashes, and a president who reacts to any restraint as if it were a personal insult. But I promise you this, by the end of this, you all clearly see what's at stake and why this moment could shape how power functions in America for generations. So let's begin. Picture the scene. It's late at night in Washington. Phones vibrate across Capitol Hill. Staffers speak in hushed voices in corridors. Senators refresh their screens again and again, trying to confirm what they're reading, because it doesn't add up. The president isn't lashing out at Democrats. He isn't attacking the press. He's enraged at his own party, and for the first time in years, that party is pushing back. I've followed politics long enough to recognize the difference between performance and real resistance. For years, so much of what passed as Republican opposition was pure theater. A worried quote, a stern look. Then everyone fell back in line and the story faded. This is not that. What we're seeing now is Republicans actively moving to block presidential power, not in words, but in law. They joined Democrats to move forward a war powers resolution, a formal effort to limit the president's ability to launch military action without approval from Congress. Pause and think about that. Pause and... Members of the president's own party looked at his conduct and decided, we need legal boundaries in place before something irreversible happens. That isn't a policy debate. That's an intervention. And how did Trump respond? He didn't reach out. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't attempt to repair relationships. He exploded. Reports say he called Senator Susan Collins, a Republican who backed the resolution, and unleashed crude language and threats, not persuasion, intimidation. And that reaction tells you everything. Because when a leader responds to constitutional limits with rage instead of dialogue, it exposes how they truly see power. Not as something defined by law, not as something shared with Congress, but as something personal, something that belongs to them. And that belief, that power is personal property, is exactly what's fueling this rebellion. So what set all of this off? The details matter here. President Trump has openly floated the idea of using military force to acquire Greenland. Let that sink in for a moment. At first, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like a joke. Like something exaggerated online that you'd scroll past and dismiss. But it isn't. The President of the United States has repeatedly suggested, in public, that military options could be used to seize territory that belongs to Denmark. Denmark, a NATO ally. A nation the United States is bound by treaty to defend. Senator Chris Murphy laid this out clearly, and when he did, it hit like a shockwave. Because here's what many people don't fully grasp about NATO. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty establishes collective defense. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all. That principle is the foundation of the entire alliance. That principle is exactly why NATO has kept Europe from tearing itself apart for more than 75 years. Greenland is Danish land. If the United States were to use military force against Greenland, it wouldn't simply be an action against Denmark. It would be an attack on the alliance itself. Pause and absorb that. Lawmakers are now being forced to confront a scenario that is no longer theoretical, but frighteningly possible. An American president dragging the country into a direct military confrontation with Europe, with our own allies, over the acquisition of territory. This is not normal. This is not strategy. This is the kind of language that, in any other time, would instantly destroy a political career. But we are no longer living in that time. And that reality is exactly what has Republicans deeply alarmed. Because once a president starts treating military force like a bargaining chip in a property deal, the gears of war begin to move. with or without Congress agreeing. That's why the War Powers Act suddenly became critical. That's why Republicans crossed party lines. They weren't posturing. They weren't making a symbolic gesture. They were trying to shut a door before it could be blown off its hinges. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand how Trump actually views the world. And I mean truly understand it. Not the caricature, not the sound bites, but the internal logic driving his decisions. Trump does not approach global politics the way most leaders do. He doesn't see alliances as shared responsibilities. He doesn't view treaties as firm commitments. He doesn't treat international law as a structure that limits everyone equally. To him, everything is a transaction. And in any transaction, there are winners and losers, pressure points and vulnerabilities, assets to seize and rivals to overpower. That mindset may function in real estate. You can corner a seller. You can intimidate a competitor. You can walk away from a deal and return later with more leverage. But international relations are not real estate. Nations have armies. Alliances are wired with tripwires. Words carry consequences that cannot be erased with a phone call. When you suggest that military force is an option for taking allied territory, you are not negotiating. You are issuing a threat. And once a threat is spoken, it reshapes the calculations of everyone involved. Allies, enemies, and even your own military leadership. Republican senators understand this. Many of them have sat through classified briefings. They've seen how quickly tensions spiral out of control. They know that the words of an American president carry weight that cannot be pulled back with a single post online. That's why they're afraid. Not because they've suddenly shifted ideologically, not because they personally despise Trump, but because they can see where this path leads, and they don't want to be standing at the destination when it arrives. The War Powers Act exists for moments exactly like this. It was created after Vietnam, when Congress realized presidents had repeatedly pulled the country into wars without proper approval. The law requires the president to consult Congress before deploying troops and restricts military action without authorization. It is an emergency brake, and Republicans just slammed it. Now let's return to that phone call with Senator Collins, because that call was never really about a single vote. It was a glimpse into something far more revealing. When Trump picked up the phone and exploded at a senator from his own party, using profanity, issuing threats, and treating independence as treason, he showed exactly how he interprets resistance. He doesn't see it as democracy doing its job. He doesn't see it as checks and balances functioning the way they were designed to. He views it as personal betrayal, as a direct threat to his very existence. And that distinction matters, because the way a leader reacts when they are told no reveals everything about how they will rule once real pressure hits. Trump's entire second-term strategy has been built around projecting dominance, absolute control, inevitability, the image of a man who cannot be stopped, cannot be challenged, cannot be restrained. Nothing destroys that image faster than members of your own party publicly voting against you. So he struck back, not with logic, not with persuasion, but with intimidation. And here's what the senators noticed. It didn't work. Collins did not change her vote. Neither did the other Republicans who crossed party lines. They took the anger, ended the call, and returned to their work. That moment, that failure of intimidation, may actually matter more than the vote itself, because it revealed something Trump has never truly accepted. Loyalty in politics is not permanent. It is conditional. It exists only as long as there is shared interest, mutual benefit, and aligned goals. When a leader stops offering those things, loyalty disappears. And right now, Republicans are doing the calculation. They're examining the war rhetoric. They're watching the emergency declarations. They're seeing the disorder. And they're re-asking themselves a simple question. What am I actually getting out of this alliance? If the answer is risk and nothing else, the alliance collapses. That's the real process unfolding on Capitol Hill right now. Not ideology, arithmetic. Now there's something else happening at the same time that needs attention, because the battle over war powers is not the only front in this conflict. While Republicans were organizing around military authority, Trump made another move. He declared a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets. At first glance, it sounds like energy policy, securing resources, protecting national interests. But look closer. The timeline for seeing any real benefit from those assets stretches years, possibly decades. The infrastructure required is enormous. And the primary beneficiaries wouldn't be American households, but multinational energy corporations. So why label it an emergency? Because emergencies trigger something very specific in American law. They concentrate power. They allow the president to bypass standard procedures. They pull authority away from Congress and funnel it toward the executive branch. Emergencies are supposed to be reserved for real crises, immediate dangers that demand urgent action. They are not meant to be strategic shortcuts around oversight, yet that is exactly how they are being used. And I want you to notice the pattern. Every time scrutiny increases, every time Congress starts pressing with uncomfortable questions, the temperature rises, a new emergency is declared, a new threat is highlighted, the conversation shifts away from accountability and toward crisis response. This isn't random, it's deliberate, it's a strategy. When everything is framed as an emergency, nothing gets examined carefully. When each week brings a new crisis, last week's questions vanish. When the president is constantly fighting an urgent battle, oversight is recast as obstruction. I've watched this playbook unfold for years, and I'm watching it unfold again right now. The Venezuelan oil emergency is not really about oil. It's about control. It's about shaping the narrative. It is about keeping the government so consumed with reacting to crises that it never slows down long enough to do the quiet, unglamorous work of accountability. And that work is exactly what Trump cannot afford at this moment. Because here's what most people are missing. While the headlines focus on war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter pressure is building beneath the surface, and it may end up mattering far more than any dramatic confrontation. I'm talking about oversight, paper trails, timelines, the slow procedural machinery of government accountability. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has been raising sharp, targeted questions. Not accusations, but questions. Why have promised documents not been released on time? Why have review schedules stretched endlessly? Why have legally required deadlines quietly passed with no explanation? These are not partisan attacks. These are questions about process. And process questions are exactly what administrations fear most. Here's why. When a senator gives a fiery speech criticizing the president, it's expected. It's political theater. Everyone shrugs and moves on. Nothing really changes. But when a senator starts asking about Inspector General compliance, missed deadlines, and chains of documentation, that's different. That's the start of a paper trail. And paper trails are immune to political loyalty. Records are stubborn things. They don't vanish after a post online. They don't fade away at a rally. They sit quietly in filing cabinets and on servers, waiting to be examined, requested, or subpoenaed. The administration itself described certain disclosures as urgent, transparent, imminent, a priority. The language was strong. The follow-through has been far slower than promised. And when the gap between rhetoric and reality becomes visible, credibility takes a hit. Once credibility is damaged, every future explanation is met with deeper doubt. That is the trap Trump is trying desperately to avoid. A request for an inspector general review is not an accusation. It is an acknowledgement that something in the process isn't functioning properly, whether due to mismanagement, shifting priorities, or something else entirely. But for a president who interprets every inquiry as a hostile act, even neutral oversight feels like combat. And that's the core problem. Oversight is not optional. It is how democratic systems operate. It is how power remains accountable. It is how citizens can tell whether leaders are actually doing what they claim. When a president treats oversight as an enemy rather than a safeguard, the entire structure begins to shake. So what are Republican senators really worried about? It's not only Trump. It's not just this presidency. It's what comes next. Because here's the reality about constitutional norms. Once they're broken, they don't automatically repair themselves. Precedents set by one president become tools for the next. Shortcuts taken today become standard practice tomorrow. If a president can declare emergencies to bypass Congress whenever it's convenient, future presidents will do the same. If a president can threaten military action against allies without consequences, future presidents will push even further. If a president can treat oversight as sabotage and intimidate lawmakers who disagree, that playbook gets inherited. Republicans understand this, especially those who've been in Washington long enough to watch power slowly accumulate. They know that protecting one president today may empower a very different president tomorrow, one they don't support, one they can't control. That's why some of them are finally drawing lines. Not because they've suddenly changed their personal opinion of Trump, but because they're thinking about the institution itself, about the role of the Senate, about whether Congress will still matter in 10 years if these precedents are allowed to stand. That calculation is what's fueling this revolt. It's not ideological, it's structural. It is Republicans asking themselves a hard question. If we don't stop this now, will we even be able to stop it later? And more, the answer they're reaching is no. Because once a president successfully argues that he is guided only by personal judgment, not by law, not by treaties, not by constitutional limits, the office itself begins to change. At that point, the presidency stops being a role within a system and begins to see itself as the system. And that transformation is what some Republicans are now trying to stop. Quietly, cautiously, fully aware that they might fail, but pushing forward anyway because the alternative is far worse. Let's bring this down from theory for a moment, because everything we've been talking about, the constitutional arguments, the power struggles, the procedural battles, has real consequences for real people. When a president threatens military action, military families feel it first. They're the ones who get deployed. They're the ones who wait. They're the ones who don't always come home. When trade relationships are shaken by erratic foreign policy, workers feel it. Orders get canceled. Supply chains break. Jobs vanish. When allies begin to doubt America's commitments, everyone feels the impact. The dollar weakens. Security agreements fray. The world becomes less stable, less predictable. None of this is abstract. The rhetoric about Greenland and Denmark isn't just awkward or embarrassing, it's dangerous. It forces European allies to question whether American protection can still be trusted. It encourages adversaries to test boundaries and exploit confusion. It pushes neutral countries to rethink which side they want to align with. That loss of trust doesn't appear in a single headline. It builds slowly, deal by deal, relationship by relationship, until one day America wakes up more isolated than it ever expected. And the emergency declarations aren't just constitutional issues, they distort the economy. When presidents use emergency powers to steer resources toward political objectives instead of real crises, markets warp. Investments flow to the wrong places. The economy starts serving politics instead of people. That's what's truly at stake here. Not just principles, not just norms, lives, livelihoods, the basic stability that allows people to plan their futures. When government becomes unpredictable, ordinary people pay the price. They can't hedge against chaos. They depend on systems working the way they're supposed to. The Republican pushback isn't only about limiting presidential authority. It's about preserving the predictability that makes normal life possible. So where does this go from here? I'm not going to offer predictions. Anyone who claims they know exactly how this ends isn't being honest. Politics doesn't work that way. There are too many variables, too many personalities, too much uncertainty. But I can tell you what to watch. First, pay attention to the War Powers Resolution. If it passes with enough support to survive a veto, that's a genuine constitutional moment. It would signal Congress reclaiming authority it has allowed to erode for decades. Second, watch the oversight efforts. The Inspector General requests, the document demands, the subpoenas. If those processes keep moving forward despite pressure, it means the institutional machinery is still alive. If they quietly stall, that tells a very different story. Third, watch the Republican coalition itself. Right now, the senators pushing back are a minority. If that group grows, Trump's leverage shrinks. If it stays isolated, the rebellion fades. Fourth, listen closely to Trump's language. When he feels cornered, he escalates. More emergency declarations, harsher rhetoric, stronger loyalty tests. The greater the pressure, the more extreme the response. And fifth, this may be the most important, watch what happens to the people who said no. Susan Collins, the other Republicans who crossed the aisle, the senators who asked uncomfortable questions. Do they face consequences? Do they lose committee roles? Do they get challenged politically, or do they survive untouched? The answers will reveal whether resistance is sustainable. Whether saying no carries an acceptable cost, whether the incentive structure inside Republican politics has truly shifted, or whether this moment was just a temporary anomaly. That's what will determine whether this revolt actually matters, or whether it becomes just another headline that fades away. Now let's step back and ask a larger question. Because this story isn't really about Trump. not at its core. It's about something older and more fundamental. It asks about whether the rules that govern power are stronger than the individuals who temporarily hold it. Every democracy eventually faces this test. Sooner or later, a leader emerges who believes the rules don't apply to them, who treats every limit as an obstacle, who treats the Constitution as a recommendation instead of a boundary. When that happens, the system is forced into a choice. It can bend, it can break, or it can stand firm. Right now, we are watching the American system being tested in real time. Emergency powers, war rhetoric, the intimidation of lawmakers, oversight framed as sabotage. All of it is pressure pushing against the limits, and those limits are pushing back. Not as fast as some want, not as forcefully as others hope, but they are responding. Republicans crossing party lines, inspectors general receiving formal requests, senators asking questions no one wanted asked, votes taking place that were never supposed to happen. That is not nothing. It does not guarantee the system will hold. History is full of democracies that bent until they finally broke. Systems that tolerated small violations until major ones felt normal. Societies that woke up one day to realize the rules had changed while everyone was distracted. But collapse is not inevitable either. Systems survive only when people choose to make them survive. When lawmakers decide their oath matters more than their career. When institutions value function over convenience. When citizens stay engaged even when it's tiring, even when it's uncomfortable. None of this happens automatically. It all requires choice. And right now, some people are making that choice. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but deliberately. That is the real story beneath all the noise. Let me bring this together with 3 things you need to remember. First, this revolt is real. Republicans are no longer just expressing concern behind closed doors. They are voting. They are advancing resolutions. They are drawing boundaries they have avoided for years. That doesn't mean they will win, but it is happening. And it matters. Second, emergency powers are being turned into weapons. The pattern is unmistakable. As scrutiny grows, a new crisis appears. The conversation shifts away from accountability and toward urgency. This is not coincidence, it is strategy. And recognizing the strategy is the first step toward not being controlled by it. Third, precedents outlive presidents. Whatever emerges from this conflict will shape how power operates long after Trump is gone. The shortcuts taken today become the standards of tomorrow. That's why the stakes go far beyond any single individual or any single election. These 3 forces, the revolt, the weaponized emergencies, and the precedent problem, are deeply connected. They are different angles of the same question. Can a system restrain a leader who refuses to believe restraint should apply to him? We are about to find out. Here's what I want to leave you with. Democracy does not defend itself. It relies on people. Lawmakers who honor their oath. Institutions that choose responsibility over politics. Citizens who stay attentive even when it's exhausting. Everyone doing their part, holding the line. Right now, some of that is happening. Not enough, perhaps. Not fast enough, almost certainly. But it is happening. And the resistance to Trump is no longer coming only from the outside. It is coming from within. From people who know him, who worked with him, who defended him, and who have now decided that some lines cannot be crossed. That matters. It does not promise a happy ending. History is filled with ignored warnings, missed chances, systems that bent until they shattered. But it is a reminder that outcomes are not fixed, that choices matter, that individuals, at the right moment, can change the direction of events. We are in one of those moments right now. What happens next depends on whether enough people, in Congress, in institutions, and in the public, decide that the rules matter more than any one person. That power should be constrained, not owned. That democracy is worth the effort it takes to maintain it. If this story helped you see what's really happening, don't stay on the sidelines. Subscribe to the channel and stay with me. This conversation is far from over, and write a comment below. Do you believe this revolt will hold, or will party loyalty ultimately prevail? Your perspective matters, and I genuinely want to hear it. Thank you for staying with me until the end.